It was not the scream that shattered the equilibrium of the House of Windsor, but the sudden, suffocating silence. Consider the anomaly. For 6 years, the narrative flowing from the sun-drenched hills of Montecito to the greystone facades of London has been a relentless, deafening torrent. It was a calculated bombardment of interviews, documentaries, and memoirs, each designed to chip away at the bedrock of a thousand-year-old institution. Yet, in the wake of what insiders labeled the most unprecedented development since the departure of 2020, the noise has abruptly been severed. The American Duchess, who stood by her floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out at the silver-leafed olive trees, had staked her entire reputation on a high-stakes do-or-die media offensive. She threatened to unveil dark truths, secrets so volatile they prompted genuine fear within diplomatic channels between Britain and the United States. And then, as if an invisible hand simply pulled the plug on the entire operation, she vanished. Across the Atlantic, deep within the arid, hushed corridors of St. James's Palace, the answer to this sudden disappearance sits on a desk made of rosewood. It is not a press release, it is not a legal rebuttal. It is a dossier held by the one woman who has quietly emerged as the steady guardian of the institution. While the world watched the headlines, Princess Anne was watching the timeline. Some observers described the atmosphere in London just 48 hours ago as ice-cold before the storm, but they were looking in the wrong direction. The storm had already made landfall, but it did not strike with thunder. It struck with the terrifying precision of a forensic audit. What exactly does the Princess Royal hold in her hands that possesses enough kinetic force to silence a media machine worth millions of dollars? To understand the gravity of this silence, we must look past the glamour of the magazines and into the brutal reality of the timeline. Meghan Markle believed she was playing a game of public opinion, a game of emotion and narrative. She did not realize she had stepped onto a chessboard against a grandmaster who views the survival of the crown not as a job, but as a blood oath. The question haunting the royal watching community is no longer what will Meghan say next. The question has become a chilling whisper. What has Anne found? And more importantly, when this buried truth finally surfaces, will Prince Harry continue to shield his wife, or will he become the single biggest casualty of the war they started? The palace corridors have responded to the threats from California with an eerie lack of engagement. No denials, no clarifications, nothing. To the uninitiated, this looks like passivity. To those who know the history of the firm, it looks like a trap. The silence is not empty, it is heavy with evidence. We are witnessing the pivot point of history. The moment where the dark truth threatened by the Duchess is about to collide violently with the cold truth excavated by the princess. This is no longer a family drama. It is a forensic dismantling of a 6-year campaign. And it begins not with a shout, but with the turning of a page in a confidential file that has lain untouched since 2018. To the casual observer walking down the Mall in London, the royal standard flying above Buckingham Palace appeared as listless as ever against the grey English sky. But inside the gilded cage, the atmosphere was undergoing a violent transmutation. The word insiders are using is not anxiety, it is radioactive fallout. For decades, the royal machinery has operated on a principle of slow, deliberate movement. They are an ocean liner that takes miles to turn. But the string of pointed messages fired from Montecito in recent weeks did not hit the hull like waves. They struck like torpedoes. This was a seismic shock that rattled the teacups in the private quarters and sent senior aides scrambling for encrypted lines. The panic was not born of guilt. It was born of the realization that the rules of engagement had been irrevocably shattered. When Meghan Markle alluded to dark truths and systematic mistreatment, she was no longer playing the role of the aggrieved celebrity. She was signaling the possession of something far more dangerous. Leverage. There was a genuine, palpable fear that one individual's words could ignite a serious political incident, straining the already delicate diplomatic tightrope between the United Kingdom and the United States. We found out that there were urgent, hushed conversations that went far beyond public relations strategy. These were not debates about which photo to release or which charity to visit. These were risk assessment meetings analyzing the potential for a constitutional crisis. The palace corridors in London responded with an eerie, almost chilling silence to the public. But behind the heavy oak doors, the response was a cold fury. To comprehend the sheer magnitude of this hid, Den panic, one must understand what was actually whispered in the corridors of power. Sources suggest that the alarm bells began ringing when specific details in Meghan's narrative started to align with restricted internal documents. This was no longer about feelings, it was about data. The fear was that the Duchess had weaponized her time inside the institution, collecting not just memories but receipts. The dark truth she threatened to expose was rumored to involve the financial disentanglement of 2020. A complex web of negotiations that the palace believed had been sealed in iron. The reaction was immediate and absolute. While the press office maintained its never complain, never explain facade, the legal and security teams were mobilized with the speed of a military unit. This was the moment the counteroffensive shifted from a passive monitoring operation into active defense. The silence that followed from London was not the silence of a victim taking a beating. It was the silence of a predator holding its breath before the strike. Senior courtiers understood that responding to Meghan's provocations in the media would only feed the beast. Instead, they turned inward, initiating a forensic sweep of every interaction, every email, and every log from the Sussex tenure as working royals. However, the true danger was not in what was being shouted from the rooftops of California, but in the devastating quiet of what was being uncovered in the archives. A leaked whisper suggests that a specific memo dating back to early 2019 had been retrieved from deep storage. This document, allegedly authored during the height of internal tensions, did not contain evidence of royal cruelty as the world might expect. Instead, it reportedly contained a detailed timeline of behavioral anomalies, red flags that had been flagged by security detail but overruled by family sentiment. The atmosphere described by observers as ice-cold before the storm was the result of this realization. The palace realized they had been protecting the wrong people. They had spent years shielding Meghan from the press, only to realize that the threat was coming from inside the house. As the panic subsided, it was replaced by a steely resolve. The chaos of the initial shock gave way to the methodical, ruthless efficiency that has kept the monarchy alive for 1,000 years. They stopped looking for a way to make peace. They started looking for the kill switch. And as we are about to see, the key to that switch lay buried in a timeline that the world had completely forgotten. To understand the sudden silence of the present, we must rewind the clock, not to the explosive interviews of last week, but to a time that the world has largely glossed over. Let us transport ourselves back 48 hours before the current blackout began. While the global media was fixated on the front gates of the Montecito estate, breathless with anticipation for Meghan's next revelation, a completely different narrative was unfolding at the digital service entrance of the Royal Archives in Windsor. The public eye was blinded by the flashbulbs of a new product launch and the promise of rebranding. But in the shadows, analysts working under the direct instruction of the Princess Royal were dissecting a timeline that had been buried for nearly a decade. They were looking at the year 2017. This was the era when Meghan Markle was still a fresh name on the guest list at Kensington Palace, a time the world remembers as a fairy tale romance. However, the dossier lying open on Anne's desk tells a story not of romance, but of choreography. Fragments long thought lost to the chaos of the wedding preparations were being exhumed and examined with unprecedented scrutiny. The analysts started noticing the first anomalies in the old background reports. Red flags that had been flagged by junior security officers, but overruled by the euphoria of the moment. Strange gaps appeared in Meghan's pre-engagement schedule. There were unexplained trips and the sudden emergence of unfamiliar American media consulting entities that at the time had simply been dismissed as her personal support team. Viewed through today's lens, however, those entities revealed themselves as quiet architects laying the groundwork for rebellion. Anne received updates revealing how many standard vetting procedures had been bypassed or conducted superficially. It appeared that subtle interventions from external lobbying groups had cleverly reframed security checks as issues of discrimination, forcing royal staff to back down out of fear. This brings us to the most chilling realization of the entire investigation. While the cameras were capturing the smiling faces of a couple in love, the financial records suggest a parallel operation was already in motion. Untraceable money flows came into focus. Not mere acting residuals, but contributions from anonymous funds routed through multiple layers of intermediaries before landing. With the public relations firms shaping her image. Anne felt a wave of revulsion as she examined what looked like classic influence trading contracts. The timeline suggested that before the first engagement photo was ever taken, there were agreements in place. In exchange for lavish praise and ironclad protection from major outlets, Meghan would feed them carefully curated drips of insider information. The escalation of the probe led to a breakthrough discovery. Disjointed records of travel and clandestine meetings, with reality television producers, occurring even while she was still fulfilling royal duties in London. Suddenly, the pieces snapped together into a merciless chain of logic. The family conflicts, the on-camera tears, and the complaints about suffocating protocol were not spontaneous outbursts from a wounded woman. They appeared to be meticulously engineered plot points in a long-running script. Each scandal calibrated to boost personal brand value. The team realized they were not dealing with a rebellious daughter-in-law, but with a years-in-the-making soft power takeover operation that had predated the departure of 2020 by a long margin. Meghan had not entered the royal family to serve. She had entered to acquire the world's most powerful calling card, then turn it against the very institution that issued it. As the sun set over London, the hidden timeline was no longer a theory. It was a map of betrayal. And now that the map was fully drawn, it was time for the guardian of the realm to step out of the shadows and enforce the consequences. The time for observation had passed. In the dimly lit office at St. James's Palace, Princess Anne stood up. She did not slam her hand on the table. She simply closed the file labeled confidential with a finality that echoed louder than a gavel strike. Enter the enforcer. For decades, Princess Anne has been the royal family's break glass in case of emergency option. She is the blunt instrument wrapped in tartan, the woman who famously told a would-be kidnapper not bloody likely while facing down a gun. But today, her weapon of choice was not physical courage. It was administrative brutality. She was not interested in winning a public relations war. She was interested in ending it. Anne summoned the senior legal advisors, the golden triangle of the monarchy's constitutional experts. The conversation that followed was not about feelings or family unity. It was a cold, hard review of the letters patent of 1917 and the specific parliamentary acts governing the removal of titles and privileges. The atmosphere in the room was described by one aide as surgical. They were preparing to amputate a limb to save the body. The plan Anne authorized was not a noisy public stripping of honors, which would only fuel Meghan's victim narrative. It was far more subtle and devastating. It was a bureaucratic strangulation. Anne quietly ordered the reactivation of every internal security clause that had been waived for the Sussexes. This meant the immediate withdrawal of invisible diplomatic supports that Harry and Meghan had relied on without even realizing it. The effortless travel through VIP channels gone. The discreet intelligence briefings regarding their security terminated. The subtle pressure applied to commercial partners to treat them with deference lifted. This was the true power of the institution. Not what it did for you, but what it stopped doing for you. Furthermore, Anne drafted a private communication, a notice of intent. This document, sent through a secure back channel to Montecito, reportedly contained a single devastating paragraph. It made clear that if the campaign of dark truths continued, the palace would be forced to release its own findings from the bullying investigation of 2018, along with the newly unearthed financial timelines. It was a classic Cold War standoff move, mutually assured destruction. But Anne knew she had the superior arsenal. The royal family could survive a scandal about being cold. Meghan's brand could not survive a scandal about being a fraud. The enforcer's strategy was to create a vacuum by cutting off the oxygen of royal attention and threatening total exposure of the pre-marriage timeline, and force the Duchess into a corner where her only move was silence. The invisible hand that pulled the plug on Meghan's operation was not magic. It was the handwriting of a 70-year-old princess who had finally decided that enough was enough. As the legal teams dispersed to execute the orders, Anne walked to the window. She watched the guards change below, a rhythm of duty that had persisted for centuries. She knew that in California, the realization was just beginning to dawn. They were not fighting a fading grandmother or a passive brother anymore. They were fighting the iron walls. The Atlantic Ocean does not just separate two continents. In this moment, it separates two distinct realities. On one side, in the historic fortress of Ken's Ingtan Palace, the weapon of choice is an impenetrable, deafening silence. On the other side, in the sun-drenched, sprawling estate of Montecito, the weapon is noise, chaos, allegations, and a desperate need for a reaction. We are witnessing a textbook study in psychological warfare, a clash between the ancient gray rock strategy of the aristocracy and the modern shock and awe tactics of celebrity public relations. In London, the discipline is absolute. Prince William and Catherine have continued their duties with a maddeningly calm demeanor. They visit food banks, they shake hands, they smile for the cameras. They do not look like people under siege. To the untrained eye, this looks like business as usual. But to Meghan, watching from 5,000 miles away, this normalcy is a deliberate psychological torture. Why is the silence so devastating? Because a victim narrative requires a villain. Without a villain fighting back, without a rebuttal to dissect, Meghan's accusations hang in the air, starved of oxygen. She expected a shouting match. She received a vacuum, and in that vacuum, her own words are beginning to echo back with a hollow, tinny sound. Inside the Montecito mansion, sources describe an atmosphere that has shifted from triumphant to paranoid. The invisible hand that Anne deployed has created a sense of claustrophobia. Meghan, accustomed to controlling the narrative, is now fighting a ghost. She paces the floors, refreshing feeds, waiting for the palace to slip up, to release a statement, to do something. But the phone does not ring. The email inbox remains empty of official correspondence. This is where the psychological fracture begins to widen. Harry, trapped in the middle of this silent war, is spiraling. He interprets his family's silence through the lens of trauma. To him, this lack of response is not a strategy. It is a cold-hearted rejection, a repetition of the isolation he felt as a child. He does not see that he is being ignored, not because he is unloved, but because he has become a liability. He sits for hours obsessively tracking social media developments, worrying far more about Meghan's image than his own. He has become completely disconnected from reality in London, treating every attempt at contact from his old friends as a cleverly disguised trap. This blindness prevents him from noticing the shift in Meghan's own behavior. As the pressure from the quiet investigation begins to create cracks in her plan, Meghan grows increasingly volatile. She pushes Harry to speak out more forcefully, to break the silence himself. She needs him to provoke a reaction. And Harry, driven by love and the crushing guilt of a husband who believes he failed to protect his mother, blindly keeps walking further down that path of self-destruction. But here is the twist that no one in California saw coming. While Meghan plots her next media strike, London is playing a game of waiting. They are banking on the immutable law of celebrity. Overexposure leads to fatigue. By refusing to engage, they are allowing the public to grow tired of the Sussex voice. Princess Anne knows that eventually a person shouting into a void stops sounding like a revolutionary and starts sounding like a madman. The contrast is stark. In London, the silence is a shield protecting the dignity of the crown. In Montecito, the silence is a cage trapping the couple in a loop of their own making. Meghan Markle wanted a war of words, but she has found herself in a war of nerves. And as the days drag on without a response, the realization is setting in. She cannot win a fight that her opponent refuses to acknowledge. This war is not merely being fought on the digital battlegrounds of social media or the legal courts of London. It is being fought in the graveyard of memory. To understand why Prince Harry stands so immovably on the front lines, one must acknowledge the third person present in every room of that Montecito mansion. The ghost of 1997. The ghost of Diana, Princess of Wales, is screaming through the narrative once again, but the tragedy lies in how her memory is being invoked. For Harry, the current conflict is a terrifying reenactment of his mother's doom. He looks at Meghan and sees a woman hunted, isolated, and besieged by the same flashbulbs that chased his mother into a Parisian tunnel. His loyalty is not just marital, it is traumatic. He is the little boy walking behind the gun carriage, determined to rewrite the ending of the script. He believes with a feverish intensity that by burning down the institution, he is saving his wife. However, in London, Princess Anne views these ghosts through a radically different lens. Anne, who knew Diana not as a saint but as a complex, flawed, and deeply human sister-in-law, sees a distortion of history. She watches as Meghan drapes herself in the mantle of Diana's suffering, wearing her perfume, replicating her fashion, echoing her famous interviews. To Anne, this is not a homage. It is a heist. The Princess Royal recognizes a chilling pattern. She sees Meghan weaponizing Harry's unhealed grief, using his deepest wound as the foundation for their commercial empire. Every time Harry compares his wife to his mother, the value of their brand spikes. It is a monetization of tragedy that the late Queen Elizabeth reportedly found deplorable in her final months. And there lies the second heavier shadow falling over this saga. The legacy of the late Queen. Sources close to St. James's Palace suggest that Anne's ruthless determination in this investigation is fueled by a profound sense of protective rage on behalf of her mother. The final years of the Queen's life were not peaceful. They were plagued by the constant anxiety of the Sussex attacks. The stress of the interview in 2021, the threats of the memoir, these were heavy burdens placed on a 96-year-old woman devoted to duty. Anne has not forgotten. And more importantly, she has not forgiven. For Anne, the dark truths Meghan threatens to reveal are nothing compared to the dark truth of those final years. That the Queen was betrayed by her own grandson in her moment of greatest frailty. This is what steels Anne's resolve. She is not just protecting the crown, she is balancing the scales for her mother. The irony is heartbreaking. Harry believes he is honoring his mother by fighting for freedom. In reality, he is desecrating his grandmother's legacy of service. He has become the very thing the royal family fears most. A loose cannon loaded with historical grievance. But there is one more ghost that Anne sees. One that Harry is too blind to recognize. It is the ghost of the Duke of Windsor. The king who abdicated for love and spent the rest of his life in a gilded cage of exile. Bitter and irrelevant, steered by an American divorcee. Anne sees the parallel with terrifying clarity. She knows that history is not repeating itself in the way Harry thinks. He is not becoming the hero who saves the princess. He is becoming the tragic figure who gave up everything for a mirage. As the sun dips below the horizon in California, casting long shadows across the olive groves, the weight of these ancestors presses down. The past is not dead. It is the fuel for the fire that threatens to consume them all. We have arrived at the precipice. Beyond the personal feuds and the tabloid headlines lies a terrifying reality that few are willing to speak aloud. This is no longer about a family quarrel. It is about the potential extinction event of the British monarchy as we know it. Inside the strategy rooms of Buckingham Palace, they call it the doomsday scenario. The fear is not that Meghan Markle will reveal a secret about who made who cry. The fear is that she will detonate a narrative bomb so potent that it fractures the very foundation of the Commonwealth. If the dark truths she alludes to involve accusations of systemic institutional racism backed by even a shred of manufactured evidence, the fallout would be catastrophic. We are talking about the potential loss of support from 56 nations, the unraveling of the Queen's life's work, and a constitutional crisis that could see the House of Windsor stripped of its relevance in the 21st century. This is the gun pointed at the head of the institution. And this is exactly why Princess Anne has shifted into the mindset of a fortress defender at war. She understands that if the monarchy submits to blackmail, if they pay the ransom of silence, they lose their moral authority to rule. But if they fight back with the full force of their arsenal, they risk looking like bullies crushing a woman of color. It is a trap of diabolical design. However, Anne has calculated a different path. She believes that the only way to avoid the doomsday scenario is to execute a root and branch purge. Whispers from the corridors of power suggest that legal drafts are already being prepared for the ultimate sanction. The removal of the Duke of Sussex from the line of succession and the stripping of his status as a counselor of state. This is the nuclear option. It is a move that has not been made in centuries, a legislative act that would require the cooperation of Parliament. For Anne, the survival of the institution outweighs any personal tie. She has looked at the numbers. She has read the public sentiment, and she has concluded that Harry and Meghan have become a necrotic limb. To save the body, the limb must be severed completely. But the risks are astronomical. If Anne pushes the button on this purge, she risks turning Harry into a permanent martyr. She risks creating a rival court in America, a monarchy in exile that feeds on grievance forever. Yet she seems willing to take that bet. Why? Because she has seen the dossier. She knows that what Meghan is hiding, the financial trails, the calculated manipulation, the pre-planned exit strategy, is damning enough to neutralize the martyrdom. The Doomsday Sea. Nario is not just about the fall of a crown. It is about the death of a relationship. If this final step is taken, there will be no reconciliation, no Christmas invites, no healing. It will be a total permanent erasure. As the lights burn late in the offices of the royal attorneys, the world holds its breath. The silence from London is not peace. It is the deep intake of air before the final fatal plunge. The button has not been pressed yet, but for the first time in history, the finger is resting heavily upon it. After the closed-door meeting in London, an eerily still atmosphere began to settle over the Montecito estate. No press statements came roaring back from the palace. No fiery counter-arguments erupted across political forums. Yet the British royal family's silence carried a crushing, almost apocalyptic weight, like the dead calm before a cataclysmic flood. Across the ocean, Meghan Markle started to sense a fundamental shift in the very air around her. Calls from major media partners grew sparse. Editors who once chased her now hesitated, and most tellingly, the network of close sources that had always been ready to feed her ammunition suddenly went mute. Meghan's mindset swung from towering confidence to utter disorientation. She had no precise knowledge of what had transpired inside that sealed London room, but the abrupt drying up of financial lifelines and the sudden withdrawal of her carefully cultivated alliances told her that an invisible force had severed every artery feeding her operation. She still held the phone in her hand, fingers hovering over drafts of the next round of attacks. But for the first time in her life, she did not dare press send. Princess Anne's silence was not weakness. It was the presence of a verdict already rendered but not yet pronounced. But the greatest tragedy was not professional. It unfolded within the walls of their own home. Harry, once her most loyal shield, began to notice the anomalies in his wife's silence. He no longer saw a Meghan blazing with righteous fury. He saw only a woman scrambling to cover her tracks. Fragments from Anne's investigation, never officially released, somehow seeped into Harry's awareness through documents delivered to him in utter quiet. The way Harry looked at Meghan now held no more blind adoration. Instead, there was a chilling emptiness. He began to recognize the artifice in the tears that once melted his heart. The calculation behind the campaigns he had once believed were fought for freedom. The single thread that had bound him to their life in America, his faith in her, snapped completely. The betrayal he had felt from the family he once trusted paled beside the realization that the person he loved most might have regarded him merely as a tool in her power game. Harry stood there in the opulent room, utterly alone, watching his trembling wife confronted by invisible pressures. And for the first time, he did not reach out to take her hand. On the front pages, the public began to buzz about Meghan's sudden disappearance from the news cycle. No more sharp declarations, no more veiled hints at dark truths. Speculation swirled about undisclosed drastic measures that had finally been deployed. But the truth was simpler and more devastating. The most powerful measure of all was reality itself. The war Meghan had ignited did not end in an explosion. It ended in absolute deafening silence. In London, Princess Anne closed the final dossier. She sought no applause. Her victory resided precisely in this stillness. Meghan had chosen silence to preserve whatever scraps remained of her position, and Harry had chosen silence because his belief had turned to ash. The shadow of calculation receded, leaving behind a hauntingly open ending about the true cost of betrayal and the quiet, unshakable strength of a monarchy that needed no words to reaffirm its place. Duty or freedom, the cold truth of the palace or the burning ambition of Montecito. We have laid the files bare, but the final verdict belongs to you. In your opinion, between Princess Anne's cold silence and Meghan's desperate silence at the end of the tale, which one is the true powerful weapon capable of ending a war? Share your thoughts with us in the comment section below.